Part 1. How Silence Begins to Work on a Life. Silence is rarely approached as an active element of human systems. Most people encounter it as a gap, something that happens when communication temporarily stops, when input is missing, or when nothing has yet replaced what was there before. In social, professional, and informational systems, gaps are uncomfortable. They interrupt flow, slow coordination, and introduce ambiguity. Because of this, systems evolve in ways that minimize silence without ever naming it as something to eliminate. Over time, silence becomes framed as absence. Absence of engagement, absence of clarity, absence of contribution. When someone grows quiet, the surrounding system does not wait. It compensates. Meaning is inferred. Motives are guessed. Intentions are assigned. Silence forces interpretation, and interpretation creates uncertainty. Systems are designed to reduce uncertainty. This is why silence is rarely neutral. It destabilizes predictability. It delays feedback loops. It removes the immediate confirmation that systems rely on to function smoothly. No policy needs to exist for this to work. Incentives do the job quietly. Responsiveness is rewarded. Availability is praised. Visibility is interpreted as reliability. Silence, by contrast, becomes associated with friction. Within such systems, most people do not decide to avoid silence. They learn to avoid it. They adapt. They begin to speak sooner than necessary, explain more than required, respond faster than they need to. These behaviors feel natural because they are reinforced constantly. Silence, meanwhile, begins to feel risky not because it causes harm, but because it removes certainty. This is the environment in which most lives take shape. I didn't recognize this environment for what it was when I first noticed something was wrong. I wasn't analyzing incentives or structures. I was simply tired in a way that didn't align with my circumstances. On paper, everything was functioning. I was productive, I was responsive, I was present, conversations flowed, work progressed, nothing obvious was broken. And yet, there was a persistent sense of internal motion that never fully stopped. Even in moments that were supposed to be quiet, something in me remained alert, anticipating, preparing, framing. I began to notice how often my thoughts were structured around explanation. If this happens, I'll say this. If they ask, I'll clarify that. I should probably explain why I did this, just in case. These thoughts weren't anxious in the traditional sense. They were procedural, almost professional. One evening, the realization surfaced without drama. I am always explaining myself, even when no explanation has been requested. That sentence wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. I explained decisions no one questioned. I justified pauses no one noticed. I preemptively defended choices no one challenged. I wasn't responding to actual demands. I was responding to an internalized system that expected constant legibility. In that system, silence felt unsafe. Silence made me unreadable. When I delayed a response, my mind filled the gap on behalf of others. They'll assume something. They'll think I'm disengaged. I should clarify before this becomes a problem. So I clarified. Automatically, efficiently, repeatedly. From the system's perspective, this worked perfectly. There was little friction. Communication stayed smooth. I appeared reliable, present, and aligned. From my own perspective, something else was happening. I was exhausted in a structural way. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from effort, but the kind that comes from constant self-regulation. From always staying slightly ahead of the moment. From never allowing attention to fully settle. The first time I intentionally allowed silence to exist was not planned. It happened during an evening with no task attached to it, no screen, no audio, no obligation, just unstructured time. The discomfort arrived quickly. It wasn't boredom, it wasn't sadness. It was a vague internal pressure, the sense that something needed to be done, though nothing specific came to mind. My hand moved toward my phone almost reflexively, and that movement caught my attention. Why am I reaching for this? I wondered. What exactly am I trying to restore? I stopped, not out of discipline, but out of curiosity. What followed was subtle but disorienting. Without constant input, my internal narration began to loosen. Thoughts lost their linear structure. There was no clear objective guiding them forward. No optimization, no evaluation. It felt inefficient, unproductive, almost irresponsible. That reaction revealed more than the silence itself. I wasn't uncomfortable because silence was empty. I was uncomfortable because silence removed the scaffolding that kept my internal system stable. Noise in all its forms had been acting as structural support. As long as something was happening, my attention stayed anchored. Silence removed that anchor. Over the next several days, I began to notice how actively I avoided silence without realizing it. I filled conversational gaps instinctively. I explained pauses. I responded quickly, even when no response was expected. Silence wasn't absent from my life, it was being overridden. From a systems perspective, this behavior is predictable. Continuous input prevents internal feedback from surfacing. When attention is always occupied, deeper signals never fully register. Fatigue, misalignment, doubt, these remain diffuse, unresolved. Silence removes interference. As I allowed quiet moments to persist slightly longer, patterns began to surface, not dramatic emotions but structural tendencies. Why do I feel guilty when I don't respond immediately? Why does waiting feel like negligence? Why do I assume silence must be interpreted negatively? These questions didn't demand answers, they revealed conditions. I wasn't trying to change myself. I was trying to observe the system I was operating within. Nothing spectacular happened as a result. My life didn't simplify. My responsibilities didn't disappear. I didn't become calmer overnight. But something important shifted. Silence stopped feeling like failure. I didn't withdraw. I didn't reject communication. I simply stopped treating every pause as a flaw that needed correction. I allowed gaps to remain. I delayed responses without justification. I let conversations breathe. The system reacted, but not in the way I expected. Some people filled the silence themselves. Some asked clarifying questions. Some noticed nothing at all. Very little actually broke. The urgency I had been responding to was largely internal. Stepping back from this experience, the pattern becomes clearer. Most people are embedded in systems that reward constant output. Systems where silence is interpreted before it is understood. Systems that quietly teach you to stay visible, responsive, and explainable. You don't need to escape these systems to work with silence. You only need to interrupt one reflex. The next time a pause appears in a conversation, in a decision, in your day, resist the urge to immediately fill it. Notice what explanation forms automatically. Notice what fear or assumption arises. Write it down if you need to. Do nothing else. Let the silence last long enough to reveal what it removes. That is the first function of silence. Not peace, not calm, not clarity, but visibility. Everything that follows in the next parts builds on this foundation. Once silence is no longer treated as absence, it becomes a tool. A way to see the systems that have been quietly shaping your life long before you ever notice them. Part 2. When silence starts reshaping behavior. Once silence stops being treated as a mistake, its effects move beyond awareness and begin to alter behavior. Not abruptly, not visibly, but through small, almost imperceptible shifts in how actions are chosen and timed. From a systems perspective, behavior is rarely driven by intention alone. It is shaped by feedback loops. Signals arrive, responses follow, outcomes reinforce future responses. In environments saturated with noise messages, opinions, requests, expectations, these loops accelerate. Decisions are made quickly, often reactively, because speed itself is rewarded. Silence interrupts this acceleration. When silence enters a system, it stretches the interval between signal and response. That interval matters more than it appears. It creates space where automatic behavior loses its dominance and slower processes begin to surface. Reflection does not appear as a deliberate act. It appears as hesitation, and hesitation, in most systems, is treated as inefficiency. This is why silence initially feels unproductive. It breaks the rhythm that behavior has adapted to follow. Before silence, behavior tends to optimize for immediacy. Messages are answered as soon as they arrive. Tasks are addressed as they surface. Decisions are made at the moment they are requested. This creates a sense of flow, but it also externalizes control. Behavior becomes shaped by what appears next, not by what matters most. Silence changes that ordering. By delaying response, even slightly, it weakens the authority of incoming signals. Not permanently, but enough to allow another question to emerge. Do I need to act on this now? That question rarely appears in fast systems. I began noticing this shift in myself not as a philosophical insight but as friction. Silence made my usual patterns harder to maintain. I could no longer rely on momentum alone. At first, this felt uncomfortable. Without immediate response, I had to decide when to respond, not just how. That required judgment instead of reflex. There were moments when I caught myself hovering over a response, unsure whether to send it. In the past, hesitation would have been resolved by action. Now, hesitation lingered. If I don't answer now, what actually happens? What am I trying to protect by responding immediately? These questions slowed me down, and slowing down felt like loss of competence. I realized how much of my sense of capability was tied to responsiveness. Being quick made me feel effective. Being silent made me feel exposed. The first behavioral change silence introduced was this exposure. Without immediate action, my motivations became visible to me. I could see when I was responding out of obligation rather than intention. When I was acting to maintain an image rather than to move something forward. Silence removed plausible deniability. I could no longer tell myself I had to respond. The delay proved that I didn't. As silence persisted, another shift occurred. Decisions began to decouple from emotion. Not because emotions disappeared, but because they were no longer immediately discharged through action. Previously, irritation led to response. Anxiety led to clarification. Excitement led to overcommitment. Silence interrupted these translations. I remember drafting responses and not sending them, not as a strategy, but because something felt incomplete. The urge to act was still there, but it no longer carried authority. Over time, this changed the texture of my days. Fewer impulsive decisions, fewer reactive commitments, fewer explanations offered before they were requested. Nothing dramatic was removed. Behavior simply became less noisy. From the outside, this might have looked like disengagement. Internally, it felt like consolidation. Behavioral systems rely on predictability. When someone always responds quickly, others adapt. Expectations form, requests increase. Silence disrupts this predictability, forcing the system to recalibrate. I noticed this in subtle ways. People framed requests more clearly. Some waited longer before following up. Some stopped expecting immediate availability altogether. The system adjusted around the new behavior. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. I had assumed silence would create conflict. Instead, it created clarity. By not reacting instantly, I allowed others to finish their own thought processes before involving me. Silence reduced redundancy. From a broader perspective, this aligns with how systems stabilize. When noise is reduced, signal quality improves. Fewer actions produce clearer outcomes. Feedback becomes easier to interpret. This is where silence begins to function as a behavioral filter. Only actions that survive the delay get executed. Impulses fade, obligations weaken. What remains tends to be more aligned with longer-term goals, even if those goals are not fully articulated. I began noticing that my commitments felt different. They were fewer, but heavier. Saying yes carried more weight because it was no longer automatic. Saying no felt less confrontational because it was no longer reactive. Silence changed the default. Instead of action being the baseline and restraint requiring effort, restraint became neutral. Action required justification. This inversion reshaped how I related to time. My schedule felt less fragmented. Tasks were grouped more naturally. Attention stayed with one thing longer. Not because I tried to focus more, but because there was less competing input demanding response. Stepping back, The pattern is clear. Silence does not make behavior better in a moral sense. It makes behavior more deliberate. It shifts control from the environment back to the individual, not through force but through delay. For you, this does not require withdrawal or isolation. It requires one simple adjustment. Introduce delay intentionally. When a request arrives, wait. When an impulse appears, pause. When an explanation forms automatically, hold it. Use silence not to avoid action, but to test it. Ask yourself, would I still do this if no one were watching? Would this matter if it wasn't urgent? Write down what survives the pause. Those actions reveal your actual priorities, not the ones imposed by the system around you. This is how silence begins reshaping behavior not by adding discipline, but by removing interference. The next chapter builds on this shift, examining how silence affects identity itself once behavior is no longer constantly reinforced by immediate response. Part 3. When silence begins to reshape identity. When behavior changes, identity is forced to follow, not immediately and not comfortably. Identity is slower than behavior because it is reinforced socially. It depends on repetition, recognition, and confirmation from the outside. Silence disrupts all three. From a systems perspective, identity is not something a person simply has. It is something that stabilizes through feedback. You act in a certain way. Others respond. That response confirms who you are. Competent, reliable, agreeable, intense, useful, difficult, calm. Over time, these confirmations accumulate into something that feels solid. Silence weakens this loop. When responses are delayed, when explanations are withheld, when availability decreases, the system has less data to work with. Labels stop refreshing. Expectations become less precise. The identity that depended on constant signaling begins to blur. This is why silence can feel destabilizing, even when nothing external changes. The discomfort is not about losing connection, it is about losing definition. In highly responsive systems, identity is maintained through visibility. You are known by how quickly you answer, how often you contribute, how clearly you explain yourself. Silence interrupts visibility, and with it, the reinforcement that keeps identity intact. This is not a flaw of modern systems. It is a feature. Systems need legible participants. Silence reduces legibility. I didn't think of identity when I first began staying quiet. I thought of efficiency, of focus, of mental space. Identity entered the picture only when I noticed a new kind of unease. People reacted differently to me. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, but subtly. Some checked in more often. Some assumed I was busy. Some seemed unsure how to place me. And more importantly, I was unsure how to place myself. I had been used to a certain internal continuity, a sense that I knew who I was because my behavior was consistent. Now that consistency was loosening. I caught myself thinking, if I'm not the person who responds immediately, who am I? That question wasn't philosophical. It was practical. I had built parts of my self-image around being dependable in visible ways. Being quick, being clear, being available. Silence removed the stage where those traits were expressed. At first, this felt like loss. There were moments when I wanted to speak simply to restore the familiar. To say something not because it needed to be said, but because saying it would reassert who I had been. I noticed this urge most strongly in group settings. Pauses felt heavier. I felt pressure to contribute, even when I had nothing meaningful to add. If I don't say something now, I disappear. A thought surfaced once. That sentence startled me. It revealed how closely my sense of existence had been tied to expression. Silence didn't just remove noise, it removed proof. As time passed, another realization followed. The identity I was afraid of losing was not entirely mine. It had been shaped in response to expectations. It was functional, but not fully chosen. Silence created a gap between who I appeared to be and who I actually felt like. That gap was uncomfortable, but informative. Without constant expression, internal signals grew louder. Preferences became clearer. Fatigue became harder to ignore. Certain commitments began to feel misaligned in ways they never had before. I wasn't discovering a new identity. I was noticing parts of myself that had been masked by constant output. From a systems standpoint, this makes sense. Identity reinforced by external feedback tends to align with what the system rewards. When feedback decreases, internal reference points regain influence. Silence shifts identity formation from external confirmation to internal coherence. This shift is rarely smooth. There were days when I felt less confident, not more, less certain of my role, less anchored in familiar patterns. Silence removed not only noise, but also reassurance. I remember thinking, I don't know how I'm coming across anymore. That uncertainty lingered. But over time, something else replaced it. I stopped trying to be perceived correctly. Not because I rejected others' opinions, but because I no longer relied on them for orientation. Without constant feedback, I had to reference something else. That something else wasn't intuition or emotion in the romantic sense. It was alignment. I began asking different questions internally. Does this action reflect what I actually value, or what I'm expected to do? Am I speaking to clarify or to maintain presence? If no one responded to this, would it still matter to me? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they changed the direction of attention. Silence made identity less performative. From the outside, this might look like withdrawal or detachment. Internally, it felt like consolidation. Fewer roles, fewer versions of myself maintained simultaneously. This had consequences. Some relationships became quieter. Some dynamics shifted. In a few cases, distance increased. But what remained felt more stable, less dependent on constant reinforcement. Identity stopped being something I managed and started being something I inhabited. From a broader view, this reveals a core function of silence. It weakens identities that rely on continuous performance and strengthens those that can exist without immediate validation. For you, this phase may feel unsettling. You may notice discomfort not because something is wrong, but because familiar confirmation is missing. This is where many people retreat. They reintroduce noise to restore definition. They speak, explain, respond not out of necessity, but to feel real again. If you want silence to reshape identity rather than threaten it, the practice is simple but demanding. Allow ambiguity about who you are. Let others misinterpret occasionally. Let pauses exist without explanation. Let your identity feel less crisp for a while. Write down what remains consistent even when no one is watching. What values persist without reinforcement? What actions still feel necessary without applause? Those elements are not maintained by the system. They are yours. This is how silence transitions from behavioral tool to identity filter. In the next part, the focus will shift again from who you are to how you relate to others once silence becomes a stable part of your presence rather than a temporary experiment. Part 4. When silence begins to reshape social systems. Silence is rarely allowed to exist within a group for long. From a systems perspective, social structures, whether a professional team, a family unit, or a circle of friends, are fundamentally self-regulating. They operate on a consensus of pace and predictability. An unspoken contract develops, establishing the expected speed of a reply, the normal frequency of check-ins, the standard length for an acceptable pause before someone fills the void. This rhythm becomes environmental, like the background noise of a city. It fades from conscious awareness until it changes. When one person in the system intentionally and consistently slows their own rhythm when they stop filling their designated gaps, they do not merely create quiet, they introduce a sustained perturbation. The system, in response, must engage in a process of interpretation and adaptation. Its reactions are not random, they are a direct expression of its underlying architecture, its hidden pressures, and its true priorities. This interpretive process is a powerful diagnostic tool. A group's collective response to prolonged, deliberate silence reveals what the structure ultimately values more: the appearance of cohesion maintained through constant, low-friction communication, or the reality of resilience built on trust and independent operation. A system optimized for the former, for the smooth, uninterrupted appearance of alignment, will interpret silence as a malfunction, a missing heartbeat. It will generate corrective noise instinctively. This manifests as follow-up messages, requests for confirmation, calls to sync up, or the delegation of the silent person's former role as a gap filler to someone else. The anxiety is systemic, not necessarily personal. Conversely, a system with resilience where roles are clear, trust is high, and interdependence is acknowledged will register the silence, note its presence, and continue its core functions. It assumes the pause is intentional, that the individual remains a part of the whole even when not actively signaling. The silence, therefore, conducts a real-time audit of the system's tolerance for ambiguity and its capacity for trust. This audit is a mechanical process, but it is experienced in deeply human terms when you are the one practicing the silence. The data it produces feels like social feedback, laced with judgment or concern. This dynamic became clear to me not through a designed experiment, but through a necessary adaptation. A complex, deeply analytical project demanded blocks of uninterrupted cognitive flow. For a trial period of 2 weeks, I made a simple change. I turned off all non-urgent notifications and instituted 2 scheduled periods midday and late afternoon to process emails and messages. My responsiveness shifted from a reflexive, minute-by-minute rhythm to a tidal one, with waves of engagement hours apart. I did not announce this change broadly. I simply enacted it. The system began its diagnostic protocols immediately, and the results were varied, illuminating a map of my relationships I had never seen. In one channel, a senior colleague, whose own work I knew to be deep and deliberate, seamlessly matched my new pace. Our email chain, once a rapid volley, transformed. His replies came later, but they were comprehensive, addressing multiple points with considered insight. The interaction gained density and lost frenzy. It was a system built for substance, and it adapted without a ripple. In another, a client's project manager whose performance was likely measured on keeping timelines visibly on track began sending polite, friendly follow-up emails within 90 minutes of any unanswered query. My silence was not a personal slight. It was a risk variable in her own system, a potential bottleneck that her role required her to flag and clear. Her messages were not anxious. They were systematic. In a third, more personal sphere, a close friend, accustomed to our daily stream of shared links and casual observations, reacted differently. After a day of my quiet, he sent a funny video. After another, a news article. On the third day, a simple, "You alive over there?" text arrived. His pattern revealed a system where communication was the binding agent of the relationship itself. My lack of casual engagement was not read as busyness, but as a potential weakening of the social bond, a signal that demanded verification. Observing this spectrum was intellectually fascinating and emotionally isolating. I was, for the first time, watching the machinery of my social and professional ecosystem operate without my constant contribution of lubricating noise. The urge to intervene, to send a quick "got it, working on this" to the project manager, or to fire off 3 rapid texts to my friend was a physical pressure. It felt like a dereliction of duty, a violation of the social contracts I had internalized. The turning point was a Tuesday evening. Seeing another checking-in note, this time from a collaborator on a low-priority task, a crystalline thought formed. Unbidden, I am not responsible for maintaining the default anxiety level of every system I belong to. It was a statement of fact, not defiance, a permission slip to let the audit run its course. I adopted a policy of non-interference. I did not proffer explanations for my slower rhythm unless explicitly asked. When asked, I offered a simple, non-defensive truth. I'm structuring my day around focus blocks, so I'm processing messages in batches. I avoided apologies for the delay itself. I simply allowed the new pattern to be what it was, and I observed the consequences. What followed was a gradual, systemic recalibration, not a series of personal confrontations. The client's project manager, receiving clear but delayed responses, began to bundle her own questions into more complete briefs sent once a day. The efficiency of our communication improved even as its frequency dropped. My friend, after a brief adjustment period, settled into a new rhythm where our exchanges were less frequent but more significant, our weekly call becoming a richer anchor. And numerous minor threads, the group chats that thrived on daily trivia, the email chains that existed primarily for visibility, simply withered. They had been ecosystems sustained by the constant, low-nutrient input of participation, not by a shared substantive purpose. Their end was not a failure, but a clarification. The system, adaptive as all systems are, had found a new equilibrium. My silence was no longer treated as a glitch, but was incorporated as a parameter. The relationships and workflows that endured felt less brittle, more trustworthy. They were no longer dependent on the thin, constant fuel of immediacy. They could draw on a deeper reservoir. This leads to the practical application, the step you can take. The goal is not to provoke or to withdraw, but to gather essential data. Choose one single, low-stakes system, a non-critical group chat, a secondary email thread, a weekly standing meeting. For a set period, practice deliberate contribution. Speak only when you have substance to add, not simply to signal presence or adherence to the tempo. When a conversational lull appears, consciously observe it. Resist the ingrained reflex to rescue it. Pay close attention to who feels compelled to fill that silence, what they use to fill it, and the emotional texture of that intervention. Does it feel anxious, practical, irritated, neutral? You are not trying to break the system. You are learning to read it. By strategically withholding your expected contribution of noise, you make the system's own hidden mechanisms visible. You illuminate its pressure points, its sources of friction, and its genuine silent connections. The silence becomes a probe, and the system's echo tells you everything about its shape. This is how silence scales from an internal discipline to a social instrument. It ceases to be solely about what you are not saying to yourself and transforms into a way of listening to the world's structure. The silence you create is no longer a private room. It becomes a shared, diagnostic space, and what grows, or falters, or adapts within that space reveals the true nature of the garden you have been tending. The next evolution occurs when this restructured social landscape stabilizes. When a significant portion of your energy is no longer automatically diverted to managing the expectations and rhythms of constant connection, a new resource pool accumulates. This resource is not time, but a deeper, more patient form of attention. This attention, freed from the exhausting work of external monitoring, can turn its focus inward, to the very source of thought and creation. This is where silence makes its most profound transition. From structuring your interactions with others, to structuring the generation of ideas within yourself. Part 5. When silence becomes the ground for thought. The mind, like any system under constant demand, optimizes for throughput. In environments saturated with input and expectation, thought becomes transactional. It is a tool for generating outputs, replies, solutions, decisions, justifications. Its value is measured in speed and applicability. This is thinking as a production line, efficient within its narrow lane but incapable of deviation. When silence restructures the external environment, when it creates buffers against immediate demand, a space opens not just around the mind, but within its very processes. In this space, thought undergoes a subtle but profound metamorphosis. It is no longer solely a means of production. It begins to revert to its older, more fundamental state, a means of perception. This shift is not about thinking more. It is about thinking differently. Under constant pressure, thought is linear and purposeful. It moves from point A to point B along the most frictionless path, which is usually the most well-trodden, predictable path within one's existing mental models. Silence removes the urgency of point B. Without the imperative of an immediate output, thought is granted a permission it rarely receives. The permission to wander, to backtrack, to loop back on itself, to explore dead ends, not as failures but as landscape. This is inefficient. It is non-productive in the short-term industrial sense. But it is the condition under which thought can integrate disparate elements, form novel connections, and arrive not merely at an answer, but at a new understanding of the question itself. The first sign of this change is not a flash of genius, but a feeling of frustration. The mind, accustomed to the clear metrics of solved problems and sent messages, flails in the open space. It seeks a task, a prompt, an external target to latch onto. I encountered this not during a planned retreat, but in the newly created margins of an ordinary Tuesday. Having implemented slower communication rhythms, I found myself with a 90-minute block that was, according to my old calendar logic, free. There was no pending email demanding a reply, no message I was obligated to send, no meeting to attend. I sat with the explicit intention of thinking about a strategic challenge for an upcoming project. What followed was a lesson in the poverty of directive thought. My mind, when commanded to think about X, produced a series of rehearsed points, familiar pros and cons, recycled arguments. It was parroting previous outputs. It felt sterile, like shuffling the same deck of cards expecting a new suit to appear. The frustration mounted. I was in silence, I had the time, and yet the quality of my thinking felt thinner, more brittle than ever. In irritation, I stood up and walked to the window. I watched a bird land on a branch, then fly away. I did not try to think about the project. I simply let the irritation and the emptiness be there. And in that moment of surrendered effort, a different kind of mental movement began. Instead of a line aiming at a target, my awareness became a slow, drifting cloud. The strategic challenge dissolved from a problem to solve into a constellation of feelings, vague impressions, and half-formed images. I remembered an unrelated article about bridge engineering. I felt a lingering discomfort from a stakeholder's offhand comment 2 weeks prior. I saw a visual pattern of dependencies that looked less like a flowchart and more like an ecosystem. I was not analyzing, I was noticing. The thought process was no longer under the tight control of my executive function. It was associative, sensory, and intuitive. The silence externally had finally quieted the internal director who was always shouting instructions. What remained was the observing faculty, the part that connects without being told to connect. From this simmering, unfocused state, an insight surfaced. It was not a point or a solution, it was a relationship. I saw how the perceived bottleneck in the project was not a resource issue, but a trust issue manifesting as a process issue, a link I had missed entirely while focused on optimizing the process alone. The insight felt obvious in hindsight, but it had been invisible to my goal-oriented thinking. It had required the silent, aimless space to reveal itself. This is the practical turn. To cultivate this ground for thought, you must intentionally create conditions of non-directed attention. This is harder than it sounds. It is not meditation with a focus on breath or mantra, which is simply redirecting attention to a new, simpler anchor. It is the practice of allowing attention to have no anchor at all and observing where it naturally drifts. Set a timer for 20 minutes. Sit with a notebook and pen. Do not set an agenda. Do not try to think about anything. Your only task is to write down any thought, image, memory, or sensation that arises without judgment or elaboration. If you think, "This is stupid," write down, "This is stupid." If you recall the texture of your childhood sofa, write that down. If you feel anxiety about a work task, write anxiety about task X. Do not try to solve the anxiety, just note it. For the first several sessions, this will feel pointless and aggravating. Your mind will rebel, insisting on productivity. This rebellion is the sound of the old system protesting its obsolescence. Persist. Over time, you will notice a change. The log entries will begin to show subtle connections. A feeling from Monday will link to a memory from Tuesday and an article read on Wednesday. These are not logical connections, but poetic ones. They are the raw material of integrated understanding. This practice, this deliberate silence of directive thought, trains the mind to tolerate ambiguity and to perceive patterns that exist below the surface of problem solving. The outcome is not that you will have brilliant ideas on command. The outcome is that your thought process becomes a richer soil. When a real problem or creative challenge does arise, you will not approach it with a sterile, linear logic alone. You will have access to a wider network of associations, a deeper sense of context, and a patient willingness to let the solution emerge from the soil rather than forcing it from barren ground. In this way, silence stops being a pause between noises and becomes the very medium in which understanding grows. It transforms thought from a tool you wield into an environment you inhabit. The mind is no longer just a factory, it becomes a garden. And a garden requires fallow periods, silence, and the unattended grace of growth that happens beneath the surface, where no manager is watching and no metric can measure the germination of a seed. Part 6. When silence reshapes your relationship with urgency. Time, within highly responsive systems, is not a neutral medium. It becomes a currency of reliability, a measure of value, and a source of constant, low-grade pressure. The expectation of immediacy, the faster reply, the quicker decision, the instant acknowledgement transforms time from a space in which things unfold into a commodity that is perpetually being spent. This creates a pervasive sense of urgency, a background hum that dictates the rhythm of action. Urgency, in this context, is not about true objective deadlines. It is a learned reflex, a systemic phantom limb that creates the sensation of emergency where none exists. Silence, when consistently applied, does not just create pauses. It surgically dissects this construct of urgency. It inserts a buffer between stimulus and response so consistently that the system, your personal operating system, begins to recalibrate its fundamental perception of time's pressure. From a systems perspective, urgency is a feedback loop accelerator. A signal arrives, a message, a request, a problem. It triggers an internal alert labeled urgent, and the system prioritizes a response to clear the alert. The faster the clearance, the stronger the reinforcement. You are rewarded with relief, with social validation, with a sense of competence. Over time, the loop tightens. The threshold for what triggers the urgent label lowers. The time between signal and demanded response shrinks. You become optimized for emergency response, even if you are only managing routine traffic. Silence breaks this loop by introducing a mandatory processing delay. It forces a gap between the incoming signal and the internal classification of urgent. In that gap, a critical question can be asked. Is this truly urgent, or is it merely easy to address? The system, deprived of its immediate outlet, is forced to differentiate between actual fires and the habitual glow of alert notifications. This differentiation is where the relationship with time begins to change. Time stops being a shrinking resource you are constantly losing and starts to regain its quality as a container for evaluation. The shift first manifested for me not as a philosophical insight, but as a series of small, physical sensations. I had begun the practice of letting emails sit for a predetermined minimum period initially, just 1 hour before even considering a reply. The first few times when a new message notification appeared, I felt a familiar jolt in my chest, a tightening in my shoulders, the somatic signature of manufactured urgency. My hand would twitch toward the mouse. But the rule held: do not open, do not assess, do not react, just note the arrival and return to the work at hand. What happened in that hour was illuminating. The physical urgency, unattended, would peak and then, like a wave, dissolve. By the time I opened the message, my physiological state was neutral. From that calm vantage point, I could see the email for what it was. Roughly 7 out of 10 times, the perceived urgency was entirely fictional. It was a question that didn't need an answer today, a for your information that required no action, a problem the sender was merely broadcasting, not asking me to solve. The urgency had been my own addiction, my own conditioned response to the form of an interruption, not its content. One specific instance cemented this. A message arrived from a major client with the subject line, "Urgent," timeline question. The old loop screamed into action. Adrenaline, dropped focus, immediate opening, but I stuck to the rule. I noted it and closed the tab. For 60 minutes, my mind occasionally scurried back to it, concocting scenarios of missed deadlines and angry phone calls. When I finally opened it, the body read, "When you have a moment, could you let us know if the Q3 delivery estimate is still looking accurate?" No rush. The sender had used urgent as a flag for their own attention, a bookmark, not a demand for mine. My entire stress response had been triggered by a linguistic habit, a ghost in the machine. In the silent hour, I had been arguing with a phantom. This experience repeated in various forms. The need for an instant decision often evaporated upon a second, calmer look. The pressure to provide an immediate opinion revealed itself as a social tic, not a functional requirement. With each cycle, the phantom urgency lost power. Time, in the spaces I protected, began to feel thicker, more substantial, less slippery. I was no longer standing on a rushing conveyor belt of demands. I was standing to the side of the stream, observing its flow and choosing which items to pull out for attention. This is the practical mechanism. You must build a structural delay into your most common channels of urgency. Do not rely on willpower in the moment. Willpower fails. Create a rule. Choose one digital inlet, your primary email, a work messaging app, and install a physical or procedural barrier. This could be turning off all notifications and checking only on the hour. It could be a rule that you read messages immediately, but impose a mandatory 30-minute reflection period before any reply is permitted. The key is the mandatory wait. It is non-negotiable. During that wait, do not just stew, conduct a brief audit. When you feel the tug of urgency, ask these two questions, writing the answers down. What is the worst possible outcome if I respond in your delay period instead of right now? Be specific. They might be mildly inconvenienced is different from a patient will suffer. Who is the actual owner of this urgency? Is it mine, or am I absorbing someone else's? This practice does not make you irresponsible. It makes you forensic about responsibility. It trains you to distinguish between true, consequential urgency and the pervasive cultural mimicry of urgency that fills modern systems. You stop being a reflex machine and start being a filter. Over time, this recalibrates your entire experience of time. Deadlines remain, but they are clearer, surrounded by more usable space. Your days develop a rhythm of focused work protected by silent buffers rather than a frantic staccato of reactions. You begin to sense that most urgency is a form of noise, and silence is the tool that strips it away, revealing the true signal of what matters and when it actually needs your attention. Time, in the end, is not managed. It is perceived. And silence is the practice that cleans the lens of that perception. Part 7, when silence begins to reshape decision-making. Decision-making, in its conventional form, is often an act of selection under pressure. It is the process of choosing between visible, available options based on a set of known criteria, often with an emphasis on speed and decisiveness. This model functions adequately for simple, repetitive choices. However, for complex, ambiguous, or high-stakes decisions, this pressured selection is less like navigation and more like guesswork. It treats the decision as an isolated event, a discrete node in time, rather than as the visible peak of a vast, submerged process of integration. Silence, by creating sustained periods free from the pressure to choose, fundamentally alters this architecture. It allows the decision-making apparatus to shift from a selection machine to an integration platform. From a systems perspective, a rushed decision is a form of systemic closure. It cuts off input, eliminates ambiguity, and provides the immediate output of a clear direction. This output is satisfying. It reduces anxiety, creates momentum, and marks a task as handled. However, this closure often comes at the cost of quality. The system prioritizes the relief of resolution over the optimal path. Silence prevents premature closure. It holds the system in an open state, a state of sustained ambiguity. In this state, the mind is not passively waiting. It is actively, but subconsciously, integrating disparate data points, emotional signals, and experiential patterns. The decision is not made at a conscious moment of eureka. It emerges from the silent integration as a gradually solidifying sense of clarity, of obviousness. The feeling is not, I have decided, but I see the path. This transition from selection to integration is subtle and often feels like indecision to the untrained self. The old rewarded identity of the decisive person feels threatened. I encountered this shift during a professional crossroads that appeared, on the surface, to be a simple binary choice: accept a prominent, high-pressure role or remain in a quieter, less visible position. The external system colleagues, mentors, Industry norms framed it as a classic opportunity decision with a clear expected answer. The pressure to decide quickly was immense. The hiring committee needed an answer, and delay was interpreted as weakness or lack of interest. I applied the principles I'd been learning. I requested and secured a 72-hour extension. This was not time to weigh the pros and cons. I had lists that were perfectly balanced. This was time to be silent with the decision itself. I forbade myself from actively analyzing it. The first day was agonizing. My mind, like a machine idling at high RPM, revved uselessly. It presented the same arguments, the same fears, the same projections, in a frantic loop. I felt the acute anxiety of not performing the task of deciding. By the afternoon, exhausted by the circular noise, a kind of resignation set in. I went for a long walk without headphones. I cooked a meal with deliberate focus on the sensations. I let the decision be present, but I stopped interrogating it. On the second day, the nature of my internal dialogue began to change. The loud binary arguments, prestige versus peace, growth versus comfort, receded. In the quiet, subtler signals surfaced. I noticed a profound sense of dread, not about the work itself, but about the specific social performativity the new role required, a kind of energetic cost I had never itemized. Simultaneously, I felt a gentle but persistent pull, not toward the safety of my current role, but toward a third, unformed possibility it might enable, a project I'd sidelined for years. These weren't pros and cons. They were textures, energies, and alignments. The framework of the binary choice began to feel like a poor map of the actual territory. By the morning of the third day, the decision was simply there. It was clear, calm, and carried no internal conflict. I declined the offer. But more importantly, the reason for declining was entirely different from the cons on my original list. It wasn't about avoiding pressure, it was about redirecting my energy toward a different kind of creation, one the silent integration had brought into sharp focus. The silence hadn't helped me choose. It had helped me see a more accurate picture of myself and my potential paths, from which the right action became self-evident. The practical application of this is to redesign your decision-making protocol for any choice that feels significant, complex, or fraught with equal and opposing forces. When faced with such a decision, do not start by listing options. Start by instituting a mandatory period of non-decision. The length should be proportionate to the stakes: a few hours for a medium choice, a few days for a major one. Announce this period if you need to. I will have an answer by Friday. Then make the process conscious. Step 1. Gather, then release. Spend a limited time, 30 to 60 minutes, writing down every relevant fact, feeling, option, and fear. Get it all out of your head and onto paper or a digital document. This is your data dump. Then, close the document. Do not review it. The goal is to transfer the burden of holding information from your working memory, freeing it for integration. Step 2. Impose active silence. For the remainder of your non-decision period, explicitly forbid conscious analysis of the decision. When your mind loops back to it, gently acknowledge the thought and redirect your attention to a fully engaging, non-analytical activity: physical labor, immersive reading of fiction, detailed craftwork, walking in nature. The key is the activity must absorb your cognitive focus, leaving no room for the deliberate weighing process. Step 3. Capture emergent signals. Keep a small notebook or note-taking app handy. Your only task during this period is to jot down any spontaneous thoughts, images, metaphors, or bodily sensations related to the decision that arise unbidden. Don't force them. Just record them. You might note tightness in chest when imagining the office, or suddenly remembered the feeling of finishing the X project, or image of a flowing river versus a locked door. Step 4. Review for pattern, not logic. At the end of the silence period, reopen your initial data dump and read it alongside your notes of emergent signals. Do not look for a winning argument. Look for a coalescing pattern. Do the spontaneous signals cluster around one option with a sense of opening, alignment, or quiet rightness? Do they highlight a hidden cost or a forgotten joy? The decision often announces itself through the pattern of these quiet impressions. This protocol leverages silence not as empty space, but as a necessary incubation environment. It moves decision-making from the crowded, noisy conference room of your conscious mind into the silent, integrative laboratory of your broader awareness. You are not deciding better. You are allowing the decision to form completely before you acknowledge it. In doing so, you exchange the anxiety of choice for the confidence of clarity. The goal is no longer to make the right decision, but to become the person for whom the right path becomes unmistakably clear. Part 8. When silence reshapes your information ecology. An information ecology, much like a natural one, is defined by inputs, processing, and outputs. In the modern system, the input stage is overwhelmingly biased toward abundance and velocity. News, analysis, opinions, entertainment, and social updates flow in a continuous high-volume stream. The system's design rewards consumption. More reading, more watching, more listening is equated with being informed, connected, and relevant. This sets a default rhythm of mental digestion that is rapid and shallow. The mind becomes a processing plant for inbound material, and its primary metric becomes throughput. Silence, when applied at the intake stage, acts not as a stopper but as a strategic filter. It introduces a critical, often missing element: selective deprivation. By deliberately creating zones of zero input, you force the information ecology to rebalance. The system, deprived of its expected constant feed, must draw on internal resources. It begins to prioritize depth over breadth, integration over accumulation, and signal over noise. From a systems perspective, constant information intake creates a self-reinforcing loop. The more you consume, the more your sense of understanding becomes tied to the act of consumption itself. The system is never allowed to reach a state of equilibrium where it fully processes and integrates what it has already taken in. It is always in a state of intake, which feels productive, but often leads to a cluttered, anxious mental environment where everything is known and nothing is understood. Introducing scheduled silence periods of zero new input breaks this loop. It forces the system into a state of digestion and integration. In this state, the mind is not passive. It begins to connect disparate pieces of information, to separate trivial details from core principles, and to form its own conclusions rather than simply storing the conclusions of others. The ecology shifts from being a warehouse of external data to becoming a garden of internal understanding. This shift is rarely a conscious strategy at first. It begins as a feeling of saturation, a sense that knowing more is yielding diminishing returns. For me, it started with a week of unavoidable disconnection. A trip to a location with poor internet access removed the option of casual browsing, constant news checks, and the reflexive reach for a podcast during any empty moment. The first 2 days were characterized by a restless itch, a feeling of being behind, of missing out on the crucial updates that surely were happening without me. I felt underinformed, and by extension, underprepared for the world. By the third day, the itch began to subside, replaced by a noticeable quieting of the mental static. The endless stream of commentary and analysis that usually filled the background of my mind had ceased. In its place, something else began to happen. Thoughts and ideas that had been buried under the daily avalanche of new information started to surface. A half-formed concept from a book I'd read months prior connected with a professional challenge I'd been facing. A news story I'd consumed passively the previous week now prompted a clear, personal opinion rather than a reheated version of the takes I'd read. I wasn't just remembering information, I was synthesizing it into knowledge. The silence wasn't empty. It was the necessary space for my own cognition to work on the raw material it had already absorbed. Upon returning to connectivity, I faced a choice: re-immerse in the stream at full force or attempt to preserve this newfound clarity. I chose the latter, instituting what I called input curfews, 90 minutes at the start and end of each day where I consumed no new digital information, no news, no social media, no emails. This silence was procedural, not circumstantial. The effect was profound. My information consumption became more intentional and less reactive. I stopped scanning headlines out of boredom and began selecting articles with purpose. The quality of my focus during work hours improved because my mind wasn't preloaded with fragmented, often anxiety-inducing trivia. Most importantly, I began to distinguish between information that was merely new and information that was truly useful or meaningful. The silent periods created a buffer that allowed me to assess the value of potential input before letting it in. My information ecology was no longer an open border. It had a conscious immigration policy. This leads to the practical step. You must redesign your information intake with deliberate silence. This is not about austerity or ignorance. It is about creating a system that prioritizes digestion and integration. Begin with a single, regular information fast. Choose a 24-hour period during a weekend. The rules are simple. No news websites, no social media feeds, no podcasts, no YouTube, no non-essential reading of any kind. You may read books you have already started, or write, or engage in purely physical or creative activities. The goal is to sever the compulsive intake reflex. During this fast, keep a notebook. When you feel the urge to check, write down what you hope to find or what you fear missing. You will likely find the urges are tied to boredom, anxiety, or a habitual craving for stimulation, not a genuine need for a specific piece of information. After the fast, do not return to the old pattern. Institute a daily input silence window. The first hour after waking is ideal. Protect this hour fiercely. No screens, no articles, no external voices. Let your first thoughts be your own. This practice alone will recalibrate your entire day's relationship with information. Over time, you will develop a new sensitivity. You will feel the cognitive weight and emotional residue of different information sources. You will start to naturally gravitate toward inputs that provide lasting nourishment and avoid those that merely provoke a transient reaction. Your information ecology will become sustainable, managed for the health of the system, your mind, rather than for maximal, unsustainable yield. In this way, silence transforms you from a consumer of information into a curator of understanding. You stop chasing the next piece of data and start building a cohesive worldview from the pieces you already have. The goal is not to know everything, but to understand a few things deeply. And deep understanding, like a deep root system, grows only in conditions of sustained, undisturbed quiet. Part 9. When silence becomes the editor of output. Creation, in its initial stages, is often a private tumult of ideas, impulses, and half-formed visions. The transition from this internal chaos to external output, a report, a piece of writing, a design, a strategic plan is governed by an editorial function. In systems that reward volume and speed, this editorial function is often weak, rushed, or outsourced to immediate feedback. The default becomes to release the raw or lightly polished first draft of thought, to ship quickly, and to let the external environment provide the editing through its reactions, critiques, and demands for revision. This creates a dynamic where the creator is in a perpetual state of public prototyping, refining work in the noisy arena of others' opinions. Silence, when inserted deliberately before the point of release, strengthens the internal editor. It creates a sacred, quiet chamber where the work must stand on its own, judged not by its potential or its justification, but by its intrinsic clarity and strength before anyone else ever sees it. From a systems perspective, premature output is a form of cognitive offloading. It transfers the burden of evaluation from the self to the environment. This is efficient for the individual's mental load in the short term, but inefficient for the quality of the work and costly to the individual's long-term development of judgment. Silence before output reverses this flow. It demands that the individual system, the creator, develops its own rigorous, internal quality assurance protocol. In the silent space between the final internal draft and the moment of sharing, the work is held up to a different light. Without the imagined audience's applause or criticism, without the defensive narratives of why choices were made, the work's flaws and strengths become starkly visible. The silence acts as a mirror, reflecting the thing itself, shorn of its story. This process is where sentimentality about one's own effort dies and objectivity is born. The first experience of this is often one of painful, naked encounter with one's own mediocrity. I learned this through the painful, iterative process of writing a long-form document intended for a wide audience. My initial process was typical: research, outline, draft, a quick once-over for typos, and send. The feedback was always a mix, but it consistently pointed to gaps in logic, unclear passages, and weak conclusions, flaws I would instantly recognize in others' work but had been blind to in my own. For the next major piece, I imposed a new rule. After completing what I believed to be the final draft, I would not send it for 48 hours. During those 48 hours, I was forbidden from showing it to anyone or even thinking about it in an engaged, defensive way. I printed it out and placed it in a drawer. The first day, I felt the familiar itch to be done, to get the validation of having shipped, to move on. I resisted. On the morning of the second day, I retrieved the printout, made a cup of tea, and sat in a chair away from my desk. I read it not as its author, but as if I had found it left on a seat in a waiting room. The silence of the previous day had created a crucial psychological distance. The experience was jarring. Passages I had remembered as eloquent now felt labored. Transitions I thought were smooth were abrupt. My central argument, so compelling in my mind, had holes large enough to drive a truck through. I saw where I had been repeating myself for emphasis, betraying a lack of confidence in the point itself. I saw clever turns of phrase that added nothing but my own vanity. The silence had stripped away my identification with the work. I was no longer its proud parent. I was its first, dispassionate reader. That editing session, conducted in the quiet after the silence, was the most productive of my life. I cut over 20% of the text. I rebuilt 2 key sections from the ground up. The work that emerged was leaner, stronger, and more confident not because I had added more, but because I had removed everything that could not withstand the scrutiny of the quiet chamber. This is the practical mechanism. You must institute a mandatory silence buffer between finished and shared. The length of the buffer should scale with the importance of the output. For a critical email or a proposal, this might be 30 minutes. For a major report or creative piece, it should be at least 1 full sleep cycle, if not 2 or 3. The rules of the buffer are strict. 1. No seeking input. Do not show the work to anyone during this time. 2. No active tinkering. Do not open the file to make just 1 quick change. 3. Contextual separation. If possible, review the work in a different physical context than where it was created, a different room, a cafe, a park bench. The purpose of this silent incubation is to allow your brain to disengage from the creator role and begin to assemble the neural pathways of the evaluator role. When you return to the work after this period, you are a different cognitive entity. You are no longer the builder, intimate with every nail and beam. You are the inspector, assessing the soundness of the structure. During your review, ask these simple, silent questions. What is the core point? Is every element serving it? Where does my attention waver? Those are the sections that need cutting or clarifying. What have I written to impress rather than to express? Delete it. If I knew this would be the only thing I ever produced on this topic, what would I change? This practice does not guarantee perfection. It guarantees a significant increase in the baseline quality of everything you release. It trains your internal editor to be ruthless in cutting the superfluous, kind in strengthening what remains. Over time, this silent editorial phase becomes the most valued part of the creative process. The output is no longer a first draft thrown into the world for shaping. It is a considered statement, released with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing it has already survived its toughest critic. Your own judgment, refined in silence. In this way, you stop using the world as your editor and start offering it work that is already complete. Part 10. When silence becomes a permanent lens. The cumulative effect of consistent silence is not a collection of techniques or improved habits. It is something more fundamental, a shift in perception. The mind, having repeatedly used silence as a tool to reveal the hidden structures of behavior, identity, social dynamics, and thought, begins to internalize the process. The practice of creating quiet to see a system eventually crystallizes into a permanent mode of seeing. Silence ceases to be an activity you schedule and becomes the default background against which all activity is perceived. This is the final, quiet metamorphosis, the development of a silent lens. Through this lens, the world is no longer primarily composed of things to be reacted to, but of systems to be observed. Noise, urgency, and compulsive output do not disappear. They simply lose their authority. They are seen for what they are: features of a particular system's design, not immutable laws of reality. From a systems perspective, this represents the ultimate recalibration. The individual is no longer a naive participant, unconsciously optimized by the system's rewards and punishments. By using silence to repeatedly map the contours of different systems, professional, social, informational, cognitive, one builds an internal model of how systems operate in general. This model becomes the new reference point. When entering a new environment or facing a familiar pressure, the silent lens engages automatically. It asks silent questions. What is being rewarded here? What kind of noise is functioning as currency? What does this system fear most: ambiguity, slowness, or invisibility? The answers are not sought through analysis, but perceived through a heightened sensitivity to the underlying rhythms and tensions. You are no longer in the system in the same way. You are observing your interaction with it from a point of quiet awareness. This awareness is the true asset, the compounding interest of all prior silent practice. This transition is rarely marked by a grand revelation. It is noticed in retrospect, in a series of ordinary moments where the old reflexive self is conspicuously absent. I recognize the lens had formed during a high-stakes meeting where I was historically a key contributor, expected to think on my feet and drive consensus. The topic was contentious, the room was charged with competing agendas, and the pace of debate was fast. In the past, my system would have been flooded with sympathetic urgency, my heart rate up, my thoughts racing to form the next counterpoint, my identity tied to being seen as the decisive voice. On this day, I felt calm. Not a forced, meditative calm, but a deep, physiological quiet. As arguments volleyed, I found myself listening not just to the words, but to the architecture of the conversation. I could see the underlying system at play. The person arguing for speed was motivated by a fear of lost market share, a fear that had nothing to do with the technical merits being discussed. Another was advocating for complexity to reinforce their own necessary role. The CEO's repeated interruptions were not rudeness, but a reflex to rein in perceived ambiguity, a trigger I had mapped in previous interactions. Because I was silent inside, I could see these forces as clearly as I could see the table. When I finally spoke, it was not to add another layer of argument, it was to name the hidden dynamic in the room. I hear two concerns, I said, my voice quieter than the others. One is about time to market, which is a real pressure. The other is about technical debt, which is a real risk. We're arguing as if they're the same concern, but they're not. If we separate them, we might see a third path. The room went still for a moment. The silence I had carried internally had been projected into the space, and it created a container for a new kind of conversation. The shift that followed was not about my idea winning, but about the system itself de-escalating. The silent lens had allowed me to diagnose the system's friction point and offer not a louder opinion, but a clearer space. Afterwards, I realized I had not used a technique. The perception was automatic. The silence was not something I did. It was the medium through which I was perceiving. This was the difference between practicing silence and having a silent mind. The frantic, explaining, self-justifying inner narrator was gone. In its place was a observing intelligence that used words only when necessary, and whose power came from its capacity for quiet, accurate perception. For you, the practical integration is this. Your work is no longer about finding more time for silence. It is about allowing the silence you have cultivated to become your primary instrument of navigation. Begin by conducting a daily audit, not of your tasks, but of your perceptions. At the end of the day, ask yourself, when did I feel internal pressure or urgency today? In that moment, what was the system, the meeting, the expectation, the digital platform trying to optimize for? When did I speak or act automatically? What unconscious reward was I seeking? Visibility? Relief from anxiety? The approval of a particular person? Where did I see a system malfunction today? A communication breakdown, a pointless ritual, a wave of collective anxiety. Could it be traced to a confusion between noise and signal? Do not judge your answers. Use them as calibration data for your silent lens. You are training yourself to see the machine in the motion. Finally, understand that this lens is fragile. It requires maintenance through deliberate, non-negotiable periods of input silence and inner quiet. It will fog in times of stress, fatigue, or emotional upheaval. When it fogs, your job is not to force clarity, but to retreat to the most basic practice. Sit, create external silence, and wait for the internal chatter to settle. The lens will clear itself. The journey that began with the uncomfortable observation of a single, unexplained pause now completes its arc. Silence is no longer a tool you pick up. It is the eye through which you see the tapestry of systems that make a life, the threads of incentive, the weave of habit, the patterns of fear and reward. You do not control the tapestry. But with a silent mind, you can see its design, understand its pulls, and choose, with quiet intention, where to place your own thread. The goal was never to escape the systems. It was to see them so clearly that your participation within them becomes, finally, a choice. And that choice, made again and again from a place of silent awareness, is what sculpts a conscious life from the raw material of a reactive one. This is the ultimate function of the silent lens. It turns existence from something that happens to you into something you perceive, and in perceiving, gently guide. Thank you for listening to the end. Please share your opinion in the comments.